Welcome to GeoHistory Files. Here, history isn't just remembered, it's investigated. Every empire, every war, and every political decision leaves a legacy that still shapes our world today. If you're new here, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's uncover the story they never wanted you to know. The dangerous illusion that destroyed every empire. Every empire that ever fell believed, in the decade before its collapse, that it had finally solved the problem of permanence. The Romans believed it, the Mongols believed it, the British believed it, the Soviets believed it, and in every single case, the belief itself was the first symptom of the disease that would kill them. This is not a story about war or economics or bad leadership, though all of those play their part. This is a story about an illusion, the most dangerous illusion in the history of civilization, the illusion of eternal stability. It begins, as most things do, with Rome. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire stretched from the rain-soaked hills of northern Britain to the sun-bleached deserts of Mesopotamia. More than 60 million people lived under its authority. Its roads connected 3 continents. Its laws governed a quarter of the world's population. Roman coins circulated in markets as far east as India and as far south as sub-Saharan Africa. And at its center sat a city of over 1 million inhabitants, the largest urban concentration the Western world would not see again for more than 1,000 years. The historian Edward Gibbon would later call this period the age in which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous. The Romans themselves had a simpler phrase for it. They called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and the peace was real. For nearly 80 years, from the reign of Trajan to the death of Marcus Aurelius, the empire experienced a stretch of internal stability that was almost without precedent. Trade flourished, cities expanded, aqueducts carried clean water to populations that would not enjoy such infrastructure again until the 19th century. The legions held the borders, the Senate functioned, however imperfectly, the currency held its value. But the stability was not a structure, it was a moment. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, the last of the so-called 5 good emperors, died in 180 AD. He left the throne to his son Commodus, a man more interested in gladiatorial combat than governance. Within a decade, the imperial administration had begun to fracture. Within a generation, Rome entered what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, at least 26 men claimed the title of emperor. Most died violently, the currency was debased, borders were breached, plague swept through provinces already weakened by famine and civil war. The population of the empire may have declined by as much as a third. The Pax Romana had not simply ended. It had revealed what it always was, a temporary alignment of competence, geography, and luck, mistaken by those who lived inside it for a permanent condition of the world. Rome did not fall in a single day. It decayed in stages, each one disguised as a recovery. Diocletian split the empire in 2, believing that division would preserve control. Constantine moved the capital east to a city he named after himself, believing that relocation would ensure survival. Theodosius made Christianity the state religion, believing that spiritual unity would substitute for political cohesion. Each of these reforms extended the timeline. None of them changed the trajectory. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD when a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus. The eastern half would survive for nearly another 1,000 years, but in a form so altered that calling it Roman became over time more a habit than a description. And from the rubble of Rome, something else emerged. The centuries that followed, often called the Dark Ages, though the term is imprecise, were not empty. They were chaotic. Power did not disappear. It fragmented. Warlords, tribal kings, and local strongmen carved the old imperial territory into dozens of competing domains. Borders shifted with every battle. Literacy declined. Trade routes collapsed. The infrastructure that Rome had built, the roads, the aqueducts, the legal systems, slowly crumbled without the centralized authority to maintain them. Yet within this disorder, a new kind of power was quietly consolidating. The Catholic Church, inheriting Rome's administrative language, its bureaucratic instincts, and much of its organizational architecture, became the single most stable institution in Western Europe. Bishops governed cities, Monasteries preserved knowledge. The Pope, seated in Rome itself, claimed spiritual authority over all of Christendom. It was not an empire in the traditional sense. It did not command armies or collect taxes in the way that Rome had, but it controlled something arguably more powerful, the framework through which millions of people understood reality itself. And far to the east, a force was gathering that would dwarf anything Europe had seen in 1,000 years. In 1206, on the open steppe of Central Asia, a tribal council proclaimed a man named Temujin as the universal ruler. He took the title Genghis Khan. Within 20 years, his armies had conquered more territory than the Romans had accumulated in 4 centuries. The Mongol Empire, at its height, covered nearly 24 million square kilometers, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It stretched from the Pacific coast of Korea to the gates of Vienna. It encompassed China, Persia, Russia, Central Asia, and parts of the Middle East. Its postal system could deliver a message across 6,000 kilometers in a matter of days. Its legal code, the Yasa, imposed a uniform standard of conduct across dozens of languages and cultures. The Mongol achievement was, by any measure, extraordinary. Trade along the Silk Road reached levels it had never seen before and would not see again for centuries. A merchant could travel from Beijing to Baghdad under the protection of a single political authority. Ideas, technologies, and diseases moved freely across the largest unified territory the world had ever known. But the very scale that made the empire impressive made it ungovernable. Genghis Khan died in 1227. His successors divided the empire into 4 khanates: the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Ilkhanate, and the Yuan dynasty. Within 2 generations, these fragments were at war with each other. The unity that had been forged through conquest could not be maintained through administration. By the mid-14th century, the Mongol Empire existed only in name. The Black Death, which had traveled along the very trade routes the Mongols had secured, killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people across Eurasia. The infrastructure of connection became the infrastructure of catastrophe. The Mongols had believed that military supremacy was the same thing as political permanence. It was not. And so the cycle turned again. From the ashes of the Mongol collapse, new powers rose. In the West, the nation-state began to take shape slowly, violently, and unevenly. England, France, Spain, Portugal. These were not empires yet. They were something smaller and in some ways more dangerous. Ambitious kingdoms with access to gunpowder, navigational technology, and a desperate hunger for gold. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, reached the Caribbean. He did not discover a new world. He connected 2 worlds that had been separated for millennia. And the consequences were catastrophic. Within a century of European contact, the indigenous population of the Americas had declined by an estimated 90%, not primarily through warfare, but through disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza. The Aztec empires, which had governed central Mexico with a population of perhaps 5 million, was destroyed in 2 years by a few hundred Spanish soldiers and an invisible army of pathogens. The Inca Empire, stretching 4,000 kilometers along the spine of South America, fell in a similar fashion. Spain became, for a time, the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth. Silver from the mines of Potosi flooded into Seville. The Spanish Habsburgs controlled territory on every inhabited continent. Philip II ruled an empire on which, it was said, the sun never set. Yet the silver that made Spain rich also made it complacent. The influx of precious metals caused inflation. Domestic industries withered because it was cheaper to buy goods from abroad than to produce them at home. Spain fought wars it could not afford in the Netherlands, in France, in England. The Spanish Armada, sent to invade England in 1588, was destroyed not by a superior navy, but by a combination of weather, poor planning, and overconfidence. By the 17th century, Spain was in decline, still vast, still powerful on paper, but hollow at its core. The illusion once again had done its work. The mantle of global dominance passed in time to Britain, and the British Empire would become the largest the world had ever seen, not in contiguous territory like the Mongols, but in reach. At its peak in the early 20th century, it governed roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and a quarter of its population. 400 million people lived under British rule. The Royal Navy controlled the world's oceans. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. British law, British language, British institutions. These shaped the modern world in ways that are still visible today. The British believed, not without reason, that their empire was different, that it was built on commerce, law, and civilization rather than mere conquest, that it was in some essential way a force for order. However, the order was sustained by force, and when the force became too expensive to maintain, the order dissolved. The First World War killed nearly 1 million British soldiers and shattered the economic foundations of the empire. The Second World War finished the job. Britain emerged from 1945 technically on the winning side, but financially ruined, dependent on American loans and unable to hold its colonial possessions against rising nationalist movements. India gained independence in 1947. The African colonies followed in the 1950s and 1960s. By 1970, the British Empire had effectively ceased to exist, replaced by a loose and largely symbolic Commonwealth. The transition happened faster than almost anyone had predicted. In 1939, Britain controlled the largest empire in history. By 1965, it was a medium-sized European nation, struggling with economic stagnation and a crisis of identity. And standing in the space that Britain had vacated were two new superpowers, each convinced that it represented the future of human civilization. The United States and the Soviet Union divided the world between them with the cold precision of surgeons. The Iron Curtain fell across Europe. Proxy wars erupted in Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan. Nuclear arsenals grew to the point where both nations could destroy all human life on Earth several times over. The Cold War was not a war in the traditional sense. It was a sustained confrontation between two systems of organizing society, capitalism and communism, each one claiming to have discovered the permanent solution to the problem of human governance. The Soviet Union in particular invested heavily in the projection of permanence. Its architecture was monumental. Its propaganda was relentless. Its military was vast. By the 1970s, it controlled or influenced territory spanning 11 time zones, from East Berlin to Vladivostok. It had put the first human in space. It had built a nuclear arsenal capable of ending civilization. Its leaders spoke of the inevitable triumph of communism as though it were a law of physics. But beneath the surface, the foundations were cracking. The Soviet economy, centrally planned and rigidly controlled, could not innovate. It could produce steel and concrete and weapons, but it could not produce consumer goods, technological advancement, or public trust. Agricultural output consistently fell short of targets. Citizens waited in lines for basic necessities. The war in Afghanistan, begun in 1979, became a slow hemorrhage of men, money, and morale, the Soviet Union's Vietnam, though it came with even less strategic justification. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power and attempted to reform the system from within. His policies of glasnost and perestroika openness and restructuring were intended to save the Soviet state. Instead, they revealed the depth of its dysfunction. Once people were allowed to speak, they spoke about everything the state had suppressed for decades. Nationalism surged in the Baltic states, in Ukraine, in the Caucasus. The satellite states of Eastern Europe broke free in 1989 with a speed that stunned the world. The Berlin Wall fell in November. By December 1991, the Soviet Union itself had dissolved, not through invasion, not through revolution, but through the quiet, accelerating collapse of a system that had mistaken rigidity for strength. 74 years. That was the lifespan of the Soviet experiment, less than a single human lifetime. The end of the Cold War left the United States as the sole superpower, a position of dominance, not seen since the height of the Roman Empire. American military bases spanned the globe. The dollar was the undisputed global reserve currency. American culture, its films, its music, its technologies, saturated every corner of the planet. Political theorist Francis Fukuyama famously declared the end of history, suggesting that liberal democracy had won the final argument and that the future would be a gradual, peaceful expansion of the American model. It was perhaps the most confident expression of the illusion in modern history. The 21st century arrived with disruption. The attacks of September 11, 2001, drew the United States into two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that would last decades, cost trillions of dollars, and yield no clear strategic victory. The 2008 financial crisis exposed the fragility of the deregulated financial system that had been celebrated as the engine of American prosperity. Trust in institutions began to erode slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Meanwhile, a power that had been quietly building for decades began to assert itself on the global stage. China, under the leadership of the Communist Party, had transformed from a largely agrarian economy into the world's second-largest economic power. By 2010, it had overtaken Japan. By 2020, its GDP in purchasing power parity terms was comparable to that of the United States. Its Belt and Road Initiative extended infrastructure and influence across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Its military modernization program accelerated. Its technological sector, particularly in artificial intelligence, telecommunications, and renewable energy, began to rival and in some areas surpass its Western counterparts. The global order that had seemed settled in 1991 was no longer settled. Russia, diminished but not defeated, reasserted itself under Vladimir Putin. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 signaled a willingness to use military force to redraw borders in Europe. In February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the largest land war in Europe since 1945. The conflict, still unresolved as of early 2025, reshaped alliances, disrupted global energy markets, and shattered the assumption that great power war in Europe was a relic of the past. The European Union, once seen as a model for post-national governance, faced internal fractures. Britain's departure in 2020 was only the most dramatic symptom of a broader tension between integration and sovereignty. Rising nationalist movements in Hungary, Poland, Italy, and France challenged the foundational assumptions of the European project. And in the Middle East, the old fault lines continued to shift. The Abraham Accords of 2020 suggested a new alignment between Israel and several Arab states. But the eruption of war in Gaza in late 2023, following the Hamas attacks of October 7, demonstrated how quickly diplomatic frameworks could be overwhelmed by unresolved grievances and the raw mechanics of violence. The reverberations spread outward through regional politics, through global public opinion, through the halls of international institutions already strained by competing demands. The pattern, seen from sufficient distance, is unmistakable. Every empire, every superpower, every dominant civilization reaches a point where it confuses its current strength for a permanent condition. The Romans did it with their roads and legions. The Mongols did it with their cavalry and fear. The British did it with their navy and commerce. The Soviets did it with their ideology and missiles. And in each case, the very structures that enabled dominance became the structures that prevented adaptation. Roads built for legions became roads for invaders. Trade routes built for silk became highways for plague. Financial systems built for growth became instruments of crisis. The illusion is always the same. It whispers that this time is different, that this system is the one that will last, that the challenges are manageable, the rivals are weaker, the foundations are sound, and for a while, sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries, the illusion holds. It holds because it is partly true. The system is strong, the rivals are weaker, the foundations are sound. But strength is not permanence, and the moment a civilization begins to mistake one for the other, the decline has already begun. The world in the mid-2020s is not the world of 1991. It is not unipolar. It is not bipolar. It is something more fluid and more volatile. A multipolar order in which the United States, China, Russia, the European Union, India, and a constellation of regional powers compete for influence in an environment shaped by climate change, technological disruption, demographic shifts, and the lingering consequences of a global pandemic. No single power commands the kind of unchallenged dominance that previous empires enjoyed at their peak. And perhaps that is the point. The illusion of permanence does not require an empire. It requires only the belief that the current arrangement of power is natural, inevitable, and self-sustaining. That belief has been proven wrong in every century, on every continent, by every civilization that has ever held it. The pharaohs believed it beside the Nile. The Kaisers believed it in Berlin. The Tsars believed it in St. Petersburg. The commissars believed it in Moscow. The ruins they left behind are not monuments to failure. They are monuments to the most persistent and most dangerous idea in human history. The idea that what exists now will exist forever. It never does. It never has.